This is We the Sales Engineers Podcast, Show 17. Let's master technical sales.
Welcome to We the SEs Podcast, the show for sales engineers by sales engineers with your host, Ramsey Machaba. Ramsey's favorite dessert is anything chocolate. Hope you enjoy the show.
Hello, SE Nation, and welcome to another show today. And thank you guys for being here. So, some good news from my personal life. Today's my son's baptism. That means I'm stealing these few minutes to record this intro because today's guest was an amazing guest. And I really don't have that much time to talk about it, but today's guest is John Kerr. So if anyone's ever read Mastering Technical Sales or The Trusted Advisor Sales Engineer, he wrote those two books. And he wanted to come on the show and talk about what it takes to be a sales engineer and give us some tips. And I really appreciate that, and I appreciate you guys listening. So I'm going to keep this short and sweet because of the baptism. Show notes will be at wethesalesengineers.com/show17. All the links to his website, to the articles that we talk about, as well as the books that we talk about, will be on the show notes. So without further ado, here's John Kerr. Welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Well, thanks. Glad I could make it. Oh, look at that. A professional microphone. Wow.
Yes. Yep. It's a big one. It's almost as big as my head, and I have a very big head, so it's a big microphone. Well, maybe we can get started by you letting people know who you are and what you do.
Sure. So my name is John Kerr. I am the author and managing director of a company called Mastering Technical Sales. My organization exists solely to promote the professional skills of pre-sales engineers all around the world. And we do that with things such as keynote speeches, with management consulting, and then with good old professional skills training workshops. We do this around the world, so we don't just deliver in English and American. We also have Korean, Japanese, Mandarin, French, and Spanish as well. So we're trying to be as global as possible.
Nice. I'm assuming, do you know all these languages, or do you have other people to do that?
No. I do a pretty good job of the English and the American, but we have people all around the world who deliver in the other languages.
Okay. All right. But you were previously an SE in different companies, correct?
Yes.
Right.
So my background as an SC, I started to date myself in 1984 was my first job as a sales engineer, and I've been in and out of the profession ever since. I've been everything from an individual contributor up at 4 o'clock in the morning in my hotel room trying to get my demo to work, right, where the rep is in the room next to me fast asleep,
Yep.
to being a VP of a very large technical sales pre-sales organization.
Okay. Yeah. So you've been on the job for like 20 years now, or like 28, 24 years?
Yeah, more than that. I mean, since 1984, I've been an SE, various levels of SE management. I started up this business a number of years ago, and I've also actually been on the other side of the table, working in IT. So I've been an IT director and a kind of CIO at a company here in the US. So I've also been sold to, as well as been on the other side doing the selling. So that's a interesting perspective.
So why did you start the business?
Oh, well, it was actually created out of absolute frustration. I was a SE director at the time, and I just could not find training for my SEs. And we were always shoved in the back of the room in sales training. So we went through negotiation training and executive presence training, and God knows how many times we did sales process training, but it was never relevant to me and my folks. And finally, someone looked at me and said, "Why don't you just write a book about it?" I said, "That's a great idea." So that's how the original Mastering Technical Sales book was written by Aaron and myself back in, 2001. And then the business has just kind of slowly, or not so slowly, taken off since then. And I've got to admit, I'm kind of humbled by the fact that a simple book has spawned a business like the one we do today. It's phenomenal, but definitely shows the need for pre-sales engineer specific training rather than being lumped in with sales people.
Do you think the sales organization knows that it needs to train its SEs?
I think a majority of them do, particularly the really smart sales organizations. But all too often, they're given as much technical training as they need. I've never heard an SE organization complain about not having enough technical training, but it's their professional skills around in terms of communication, discovery, even how to work with salespeople, how to do demos, presentations, things like that. And that's kind of lacking, Ramsey, and that I think is really where companies like mine come in to push those skills, because what an SE needs to do is very different from what a salesperson needs to do in those kind of customer facing situations.
Can we dig in on that? Like, what are the differences between what a salesperson should do and what an SE should do?
Sure. So, in one of our classes, I kind of run a thought experiment, and I just randomly pick two people in the classroom, and I point to one of them and say, "You are now a salesperson," and the other person remains an SE, and you walk into my office as CIO of Acme Rocket Skates, and what's my perspective of you? And what it comes down to is that the salesperson is clearly there to sell me something, and the sales engineer is there to help me. And I think that's the fundamental difference between the two jobs, is the customer perspective. And sure, the SE is there to sell as well, but they do it in a far softer and gentler way. And they have to span the business side and the technology side and match the two together, so that it's the SE's job to prove that your product, solution, service, whatever it is uniquely qualified to solve the customer's business problem. And in most organizations, it's only the SE who can do that. It's the rep who sets the table for the SE to do it. And it's a very wide and varied set of skills, and that's why it's so hard to hire a really great SE, because you need that range of skills. You need the business-oriented skills, and you need the technical skills, and you have to be able to communicate as well, and that's what makes it so hard.
I was talking to a recruiter yesterday for the podcast. It'll be out in a couple of weeks, and he mentioned that it takes at a minimum 8 weeks to, if they find a candidate on the first day, it will take 8 weeks to actually get him hired. But it's rare that they find someone on the first day. It usually takes like 3 months or something to find a SE. He called us unicorns, and I like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I estimate there's over 500,000 SEs in the world today. I mean, that's SEs as you and I define it, and it's growing. I estimate about 7 to 9% a year. So there's actually a worldwide shortage of sales engineers. So companies are either faced with having to fight for really good SEs out there in the marketplace, or as a lot of larger organizations are doing, essentially growing their own. So I think being an SE right now, you're in a pretty good place. It's a hot market. Your skills are in demand, and if you're any good, I mean, you've got a lifetime of employment in front of you. So.
Yeah. So in your experience as you're training SEs, what is the one thing that you feel SEs should work to become better at?
They need to become better at explaining why the features of their product, say, are important to the people in the room, and make them understand it. I am always hearing from both pre-sales leaders and sales leaders, I have great technical sales engineers, but they dive down technical rat holes. They just go feature, and they don't relate it back to the business problems. So my number one piece of advice for SEs is really, features are great, and what can differentiate your product, but you need to turn them into, good old-fashioned advantages and benefits, and make sure the customer clearly understands those. And it's quite often very hard for SEs to do that. But if you can, that, along with a really good positive attitude, I think are two of the major hiring factors that I always look for when I was hiring SEs.
So how does an SE do that? How does he change from just going rattling off features and look at the coolest new technology to this technology can actually save you money or time
Sure.
or whatever?
And you kind of pretty much nailed it right there at the end when you talk about save you money or save you time. So I think the first step is self-awareness. So record yourself giving a presentation or a demo, whether it's live or a WebEx or something, and then play it back and take off your sales engineering hat and put on a customer hat. And look at it purely from the customer's perspective, who's seeing it for the very first time, and think about, does this make sense? And then in our classes, we also play this game called the Fabulous Sales Engineer. And relating back to your prior question, FAB stands for features, advantages, and benefits. And sales engineers, we're great at the Fs. I mean, we know all the features, and we're okay at the As, and frankly, we're atrocious at the Bs, the benefits. So being able to be the fabulous sales engineer and link the features, advantages, and benefits, relate it back to increasing revenue, decreasing costs, and mitigating risk for your clients. That's what's involved. It's not that hard, but it's self-awareness and a different mindset.
Is this an SE only problem, or could it be an organization-wide problem?
That's a great insight. Quite often it's organizational wide. If you look at a number of the product marketing decks that SEs are given as customer facing material, you have the classic deck, and I poke fun at them, but you have a fuzzy screenshot that you can barely read and 10 bullet points down the right-hand side. And those slides are not your friend as an SE, because they encourage you to go feature, 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 feature. So I think it's an entire organizational mindset that needs to change. And product management, product marketing need to stop giving SEs features, and they need to help them make that transition over to the linking the technology and the business together, rather than have every single SE come up with their own story, because then you don't get consistency of message, and marketing people hate not having consistency of message. So I believe it's in their own interest to do that, but probably only 20 to 30% of my client base have that streamlined all the way through, from materials to the endpoint to the SE.
Yeah, and I don't know how many PMs or product managers are listening to this, but I have a plea for them, in the sense that they actually know the most what's being sold and why it's being sold. Because as an SE, I have my pocket here in my territory, and other SEs have other pockets, and there is communication, but not always. The PMs should know all that information, and they should know what problems our solution is solving, and relay that information to the rest of the organization. So please help us out with that.
Yes, please do. Absolutely. And if there are product managers out there, remember that when you're building your decks, you're not building your decks for the Aberdeens and the Gartners of the world. You're building them for the average Joe who's sitting there in the audience that your salesperson and your SE are trying to sell to. And that's a different mindset as well, I think.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree. So from an SE perspective, is there some qualities that would differentiate a good SE from a great SE, or a bad SE from a good SE?
Yes, there are many. So one comes down to listening. The really good SEs ask a question, kind of like you do, and then you shut up and listen. And you listen very hard, and you listen for not just what's said, but the way it's said and what's not said. The Japanese call it reading the air, which I think is a great description. So listening, you get I've sat in on discovery calls where the rep and the SE have spoken for 80% of the time, and that's not a discovery call. That's a pitch. So listening carefully and reading the customer, I think, is one of the major skills that an SE needs to pick up. And then secondly, I would think a lot of it comes down to attitude as well. So I tend to label SE organizations as being the organization of last resort, in that if no one else in the company is willing to do something that's going to help the customer or make life better for the customer, then it's normally the SE organizations who do that, which is good because it helps the customer. It's not so good because it tends to enable bad behavior on the part of the partner organization or support or post-sales or somebody else, because the SEs keep falling in. So it's also a matter of prioritizing your time, and always remember what your role is. right? And what's your primary role? What's the primary job purpose of the SEs in an organization? And really focus on that and make sure that your boss understands what you're doing as well, and don't get distracted by all the extraneous stuff. So that's two. Three, because I love to do things in threes, is most SCs and most reps focus on pain, right? They focus on problems. And if you look at why customers engage with vendors, 80% of the time it's driven by pain. There's a problem, I need you to make it go away. But 20% of the time it's driven by gain, in that the customer's looking out into the future and wants something good to happen. One of my clients calls this puppy dogs, unicorns, sunsets, and walks on the beach. It's the good stuff. And I think what distinguishes the really good sales team, and I would extend this to reps, is that you don't just focus on the pain, you also look for the gain. And if you can sell the pain and the gain into the customer, that additional 20% that you pick up differentiates the good SE from the really great SE. And the great SEs look for the gain as well as just the pain. All too often training focuses on pain and not so much on the gain, and you need to look at both.
All right. I want to have so many questions right now, but let's start with what is the primary role of the sales engineer? Because that could be an entire episode on its own, but if we can break it down.
So obviously that varies a bit from organization to organization, but I like to think that the pre-sales organization is the oil in the engine of sales, is probably the best way to describe it, in that it's the SC organization that tends to make sure that deals flow fluidly through the pipeline. What comes in one end goes out the other in the form of revenue, and then to some degree is responsible for the overall upkeep and the maintenance of the engine as well, and making sure that everything is working correctly. So it's really working in partnership with sales to make sure that new logos get sold to, existing customers you land and expand and sell more. If you have a partner organization, that the partners get enabled and really kind of focus down on that. And that to me is the primary role of the SE. So I think that's the best analogy I've ever come up with. Anyway, I don't know how good it is, but take friction out of the sales process.
Okay, that last part clarified everything. Take friction out of the process. No, that's good. So what's the role of the SE in finding new logos? And what is finding new logos to those who don't know what that means?
All right. So finding new logos means that acquiring a brand new customer, as opposed to where you've got an existing customer and you just sell them more stuff. And the majority of organizations thrive from creating new customers and not just selling to the existing customer base. And it's always easier to sell to the existing customer base. So is there a role for SEs to find and create new opportunities? I think absolutely there is. Anytime an SE goes to a trade show, goes to a user group, even gets in front of an existing customer, you always want to be asking that question. Do you know anybody else who could be using our stuff? Could you introduce me to somebody? So you don't want to be overtly salesy, but any SC who can create or at least find new opportunities and hand them over to the sales or the business development organization is absolutely worth their weight in gold. And like it or not, a lot of the success of an SE depends on making the salespeople that you work with relatively happy and successful. So if you're an SE who can do that, it takes you a long way down that path of having salespeople absolutely love you. And there's nothing wrong with being loved by salespeople.
No, it actually ends up being if salespeople love you, your life is easier. They're not bugging you to do stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Because they know that you are there and your intent is good and you're there to help them, and they'll stop throwing miscellaneous things on your desk.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I always like to ask the question: do you know anybody who you think would benefit from what we showed you today?
And at this point, certainly in my company's life cycle, a tremendous amount of business is from referrals. and an SE leader who refers me or one of my guys to another SE leader, or someone who took one of our classes 12 years ago as an individual contributor and is now a director of sales engineering somewhere and just comes back to us. So it is really important.
Yeah, so that's part of keeping the customer happy. But if we leave it up to salespeople, I feel like, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, and that's based on my experience, they will want to do everything to keep the customer happy, including making you do things that's not really part of your purview or is not the most efficient use of your time.
Yes.
How would you deal with that?
So there are unfortunately many salespeople and sales leaders who view the SE organization as essentially being an unlimited checkbook. So they can write checks for people's time to make problems go away. And quite often that leads to what we call heroic efforts, right? Something's wrong with a client, all hands on deck, get them fixed. And that's not a repeatable process. So, I mean, you can't keep doing that. So it really comes down to, guarding your time and really prioritizing your time. And I think that's one of the primary roles of the first and the second line SE manager or leader, is to work with their people to make sure their time is being used appropriately and not being wasted on a deal that's never going to close, or something that a salesperson or quite often a sales manager should be doing instead, like putting together a quote or something like that. So I think defining really what are the core functions of an SE and having everybody buy into that. And if you stray outside those core functions, then there needs to be a reason why.
So how do you guard your time?
So a lot of that comes down to the relationship you have with the salespeople in particular. So if you are blessed that you have a one-to-one relationship with a salesperson, I think that's relatively easy, because then you've got the relationship, you start understanding how each other works, and once you've been working with a rep for a while, you almost become like an old married couple. You start finishing each other's sentences, and you sense exactly what's going on, and that's a great place to be. Not everybody is blessed to be in that environment. Quite often there are SEs who work with 2 or 3 reps out in the field, or if they're an inside sales engineer, they could be supporting 15 or 20 reps, and then it's a lot harder. So there are various things that you can do. For example, if you're calendar driven, always put blocks of time in your calendar for internal training, for catch up, for writing notes. We had a client where there has a whole bunch of inside sales engineers. They started at 9 a.m. in the morning. They had calls practically every hour, 9 a.m., 10 a.m., 11 a.m. They got a break for lunch, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then, from basically after work from 5 to 7, they had to do all their catch up, their notes, their follow up. And if you've done 7 or 8 calls in a day, things start getting muddled together, no matter how organized you are. So, always put in a bit of time so you can do follow up, catch up, respond promptly to clients, and, everything else. So schedule your time, calendar your time. And although you don't want to be asking a sales rep to, requalify a deal in front of you, you do need to understand, if you're being engaged, what's the business problem you're trying to solve, or is this a first call where you're trying to uncover the business problems? What's the end point of the call? I usually coach new sales engineers. One of the best questions they can ask a rep is not, what do you want me to do on this call? Because then the rep will just tell you. And if they're a really experienced rep, that's probably okay. But more, what's the behavior you want from the client once we finish with this call? So what's the success criteria for the call? Once you walk out of the conference room or you hang up the WebEx, what is it that you want the client to do? Do you want the client to agree to a proof of concept, to include you in an RFP, to introduce you to the architecture committee, to walk you into their boss's office? Whatever it might be, there needs to be an endpoint success criteria for the call. If the call is just, let's show them our stuff, that's a really fuzzy objective, and that tends to waste a lot of time. And that's probably the primary cause of friction on an SE's time schedule is, selling into, varied latent pain. You got no idea what's going on.
Yeah, I've been through that. uh,
Yeah, and every SE has. You know, the rep comes up to you, throws their arm around your shoulder, and says, "Hey, Ramsey, how you doing? No, I've got this great hot new prospect. We just need to go visit them, show them everything that we do, and we'll take it from there." And 95% of the time, that's a total waste of 2 hours. So
yeah, that's very true. Question about scheduling time for training. You mentioned you schedule time for internal training. I was talking to an account manager, and he does not like the fact that SEs schedule time for training. He said they should be in front of the customer and they can do training at their own time. Now, being a father of a 2-year-old and a 5-month-old, I don't have my own time. So, is that a common thing with sales managers? And is it okay for SEs to schedule training within work hours?
I believe it's quite acceptable for SEs to schedule time for training in work hours. That's not the account manager's call.
Right.
It's the SE's call and the SE management chain call. And I would normally reverse it, and I'd ask the rep, "Hey, listen, if I'm on a call and a customer asks me a question and I don't know the answer to it when I should, because I haven't had sufficient time to take training, you're going to be pretty upset, and I'm not going to feel very professional either." And there certainly is a work-life balance, and the company pays me to turn up, and there's not an SE in the world who works 40 hours a week. I mean, we all work more than 40 hours a week, but I have a wife, I have a family, spouse, loved ones, outside interest, whatever it is, and I need to do those so I'm fresh when I come into work. And you know what? That's the way it is, and I'm not even discussing it. And that's a little bit of a hard line, and your management team needs to be behind you. But the really top class SE organizations put aside time every month or every quarter for this training, and it's blocked out. And if a rep wants to pull an SE out of scheduled training, then basically the rep's director or VP needs to make that request, and that tends to filter out a lot of random you got to be on this call. No deal was ever lost because an SE wasn't on a call.
Yeah, just got postponed, if anything.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Lucky for me, we have a good manager that fights for
Yes.
our time. So management is very important in that aspect. I wanted to go back to the gain part you mentioned. So a lot of us focus on the pain, right? Because the customer didn't really talk about the gain. All the customer talks about is the pain. So how does one uncover what could possibly be a gain for a customer?
So I like to think of it as a technique, like walking the customer into the future. So if you were my customer, I might say, so let's think now it's 12, 15 months from now. This product is fully installed, fully implemented, everything's going great. What are some of the things that you'd be able to do in November 2019 that you can't do now? And start making the customer think about some of the positives rather than making bad things go away. So that's one technique, like make them lift their heads up and look out into the future. And then secondly, quite often gains are driven. So they're all examples of things happening in the future. So sometimes gain can just be proactively making sure you don't have pain in the future, and sometimes gain is truly a gain, like something brand new they'd never even thought of. But you do need to walk the customer into the future and get their head out of the the pain and the problems and make them think about the good things. And if you do that well, you're probably the only SE who's ever going to do that with them, and it will distinguish you from everybody else.
So basically get them to sell it to themselves.
I couldn't put it better myself. Yes.
Oh, thank you. I'm blushing a little bit right now.
All right, yeah, he's doing a little happy dance there. Right.
Hey, so I know you're busy. I don't know how much time you have left. There's one section of the show that I usually ask. It's the not so fire round. We can switch to that if you're limited on time right now.
We've got about another 10, 15 minutes. So.
Okay. All right, so I wanted to talk about discovery call preparation.
Uh-huh.
and we suck at it. As SEs,
Yes.
generally speaking, we suck at it.
Uh-huh.
How is there a method that you use to prepare SEs for discovery calls, or prepare yourself for a discovery call?
Yeah. So if you have the time, I would always take the time to do some discovery on the client themselves, and whether that's getting it from the rep, going into your CRM system, or just researching their website, at least knowing enough about who's the company, what do they do, what's their current situation in the marketplace, and everything else. Now, if you're a field-based SE, you probably have the time to do that. If you're an inside SE who's doing multiple calls a day, you kind of need to rely on being briefed by your rep to do that. Then I would think about if you don't have any pre-existing information about the client, it's a zero discovery call. There are common problems that tend to thread themselves across the industry. So if you're selling to a pharmaceutical company, the R&D division, they're all about getting drugs to the pipeline as fast as possible and getting them approved by the FDA here in the US, or whatever the relevant organization is. How could your product possibly help them do that and get it done faster? So by being able to talk about common problems, and then also how you've helped other customers, quite often that can help spark a discussion. So you don't immediately need to dive down into a demo of your product or talking about everything that your product does. Quite often just talking about other customers or clients and the problems you've solved for them is enough to get the conversation started with a customer. Ideally, the rep should at least get you going in that. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. So every SE should be able to be self-sufficient in that area.
Okay. And when we talk about sales reps, they don't always do that information. So there's a lot of overlap between our skills and the sales reps' skills. Is there a point where we do too much of a sales rep skills where we lose the confidence of the customer?
I don't believe so, as long as you always keep that hat on that you are there to help the customer. I mean, even if you were talking about timeline, for example, right? I mean, you've been in the call, you're looking over to the rep, and the rep hasn't asked about, what's your timeline when you're looking to get this implemented. That as an SE, you can ask that question, but in a softer way. So you might say something like, hey, Ramsey, really appreciate your time today. As you know, I'm responsible for putting together the technical configuration and quote for your environment. We have a number of new products coming out. It would really help me if you could just give me a rough estimate of the timeline you're looking to implement this, because then I can do the best possible job for you. Right? And so it's a very softer, gentler way of asking that question about timing without just saying, do you have budget? When do you want to get this done?
Yeah. Can you ask that question, though, about budget, though? The same way you asked the question, just about budget.
Yes, you can. Yeah, I would always check in with the salesperson first, and then I think that's more of a coffee machine conversation. So what I mean by that is anybody who's been an SE for more than about 2 months knows that, particularly when you're alone with the customer, there are times that they will tell you stuff that they would never ever tell a salesperson, just because inherently they trust you more. And the smaller the group of people that you're working with, if you're one-on-one or one-on-two with somebody, as I say, just wandering to the coffee machine in the company cafeteria at the client site, quite often you can ask those kind of questions around budget, timing, and who else you're looking at and everything else. It's a much less, business threatening type environment, and quite often you'll get an answer. Because they just want to share it with you. So, techie to techie. And I think that's one of the powers that we as SEs have that we don't use enough, is the customer's far more willing to tell us things and trust us than they are the salesperson.
Right. And you have an entire book on how to build that relationship to get the trust of the customer, right?
Funny you should say that. Yes, I do. The Trusted Advisor Sales Engineer. Yes.
Yeah, that was a great book. I read that. It's very numbers driven. Like, it has a lot of formulas where you can actually, it's not subjective, it's not up in the air. You can actually do math to rate your relationship with the customer, which I thought was cool. So
yeah, well, we're engineers, we like to measure things, right? So I tried to put some metrics behind it. Yes.
Yeah, that was cool. So just one more question before we move on to the not so fire round. I'm reading one of your your content, I guess, your blog posts.
Yep.
And you mentioned no sales strategy survives contact with the customer competition.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on that and what we should do about it?
Sure. So it's no matter how much you plan, there's always the weird things that happen. You're planning for a purely technical meeting, and the CTO walks in, or your competitor has a brand new feature in their product that you didn't even know about, and you have to react to it. So that's why I always like to think about what's the overall objective of the meeting and the strategy itself. So, for example, in the military, they talk about something called commander's intent, which means what's the overall strategy, right? So commander's intent might be we're going to capture that hill because we need to set our artillery up on it so we can cover the valley on the other side. And no matter what you do, your overall intent is to capture that hill. So when you meet the enemy and things happen that aren't planned for, you still know what's the overall objective. And I think setting the overall objective for both a strategy with the customer and for individual sales calls, and even for individual meeting people within the meetings, is kind of the way to do that. And then that way, if something weird happens, you still know, what direction should you and the rep be heading.
Okay. It reminds me of a quote by Mike Tyson. Everybody has a plan until you get punched in the face.
Yeah, once you get that punch in the nose, things change. Yes.
Yeah. So it's good to have like the objective in mind and just get there. It doesn't matter how, as long as you're ethical, obviously.
Yes.
All right, so we're going to transition to the fire round, and it's basically 4 questions which I ask almost every guest.
Okay.
And we'll see how this goes. So, other than the SE's ears, what's an essential tool an SE should be using?
Oh, other than their ears.
Generally, the question was always other than the notebook and a pen, but then the answer was always their ears.
Right.
So, other than a notebook and a pen and their ears, what's an essential tool an SE should be using?
Well, I suppose their brain is probably too easy, and
I think everybody should be using their brain. It's not specific to SEs.
Well, if you ask clients what are their expectations of a sales engineer, mid to senior level executives, they say, I want someone who understands my business, can clearly communicate with me, can design innovative solutions with my staff, and I can trust to do the right thing for me and my people. So being able to demonstrate that to the recommenders and the decision makers in the organizations you're dealing with, I think is essential. And obviously you have to listen to be able to do that. So that's my answer.
Okay. You have, how many books have you written so far?
Written 2 and working on the 3rd.
Do you want to share any information about the 3rd, or we'll leave that for later?
So over the last 3 or 4 years, we've done a lot of work around SE manager training. So no one ever trains SE managers. They always just go through regular HR training. So we've done so much of this, we decided it's time to write a book for them. So the first book was the Sales Engineer's Handbook. The second book was the Trusted Advisor Sales Engineer. Book number 3 is the Sales Engineering Manager's Handbook. And that's going to be an ebook and a paperback that I'm targeting for release probably very early next year.
Okay. All right. Well, good luck with that. I'd be interested to read that. It sounds interesting. So other than those 3 books, is there a book or resource that every SE should be exposed to?
Oh, wow. There are so many. So my cop-out response is, with a little bit of self-promotion, if you go to our website, one of the resources on there is a recommended reading list. So check that out. And it's got practically every book that I and my facilitators have read over the last 12 years, and we rate it. In particular, I would look at one of the books around negotiation, either Getting to Yes or what's the new one by Voss? Never Split the Difference.
Yeah.
And I think SEs are very poor at negotiating, not necessarily with clients, but also with salespeople and their boss and other people within the organization. And I think picking up some skills around just negotiating and standing up for yourself a little better is the way to do it. So that's my slightly offbeat suggestion.
No, that's very good. I was thinking about why would an SE need a negotiation book, but you answered that.
Yeah.
You already answered the question about time management, so we're going to skip that.
Uh-huh.
Is there any advice you would give an SE you feel they don't get from anybody else?
Oh, wow. So many ways to go with this. So my advice would be, at least once you've been in the position for around a year or so, is to keep looking ahead and looking to change and adapt. The role of the SE has changed dramatically over the past 20 years, 10 years, 5 years. It continues to change. New technology comes in. The low end of the job is getting automated. So it's really looking for where can you provide value. And I think ultimately that comes down to a question I ask in one of my keynotes: how big a shadow do you cast? So if you're the SE who just does amazing kick-ass demos and presentations, that's great, and that makes you a good SE. But if you can do that and provide value back to your organization and make life easier for other SEs and salespeople and even product management and product marketing, that's casting a big shadow back in the organization, and that's a good thing. So I think the wider scope of influence you have, the better off you're going to be as an SE, and you should always be looking to network and improve that. So don't just focus on the technology and demos and presentations. Get your head up and look at everything else as well.
So related to that, by the way, your website is masteringtechnicalsales.com.
That's correct, yes.
Right. So I'll have a link to that in the show notes. You have an article called The 2024 Sales Engineer.
Yes.
Which is kind of reflective of what you were just talking about right now.
Correct, yes.
So I'll have a link to that in the show notes as well. And
cool.
Everybody can read it. That's it. That's all my questions for you. I appreciate your time. Appreciate you spending it with me.
So. Well, I love it. As I said, the mission of the company is to improve the profession of pre-sales engineers all around the globe, one piece at a time. So hope this helps.
No, at least it helps me. Then.
Okay, well, there you go.
So it helped one person, which is good. And I'm sure it'll help others. So thank you for that.
Fantastic.
Okay.
All right, look forward to seeing the end result.
Me too.
All right, take care.
Take care. Bye.
All right, bye-bye.
This brings us to the end of our show. I really got to go, otherwise my wife will kill me for missing the baptism, which is not going to happen. But I really wanted to take a few seconds here to thank John for coming onto the show. I know he has a very busy schedule. We were trying to get this to work for a while. So thank you, John, for doing that. And John's been doing this for a while, as you can see during the interview, although my math was way off, but he's been doing it for a while. And if you guys are interested in reaching out to him, it's masteringtechnicalsales.com. I'm not affiliated, so feel free to reach out to him directly, or you can go to my show notes at wetheSalesEngineers.com/show17. I'll have a link to his website. Thank you guys for listening. I gotta go, and I will see you next week. With that, this is Ramsey signing off.